Hello, my name is Eric Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about thought and thinking. I get questions from time to time about, do we create our own thoughts? Do we choose our thoughts? Do thoughts simply arise? Then do I identify with them? These kind of things. Often I think this is kind of a dead end because you simply just need to not worry about thoughts. Ignore thoughts. Don't pay the mind any mind. But sometimes people have this deep curiosity on knowing thought. And so I thought I would do this video. Now, if we go way back, newborns don't think. Newborns have what psychologists call an oceanic feeling. There's no sense of other. There's no real sense of me. And there's no thought. There's no labeling. There's no commenting. All these conceptual things have not arisen yet. Though we quickly start thinking in terms of concepts. Even as very young children, parents are teaching their children. So they'll be pointing at things: circle, square, doggy, kitty, and the concepts of, oh, this is what that is, this is what that is, this is what that is, and then we start associating labels with it. We soon start building up, you could say, a library of concepts and labels and other things that become something that we can fall back on anytime we want to think about something. Because it's not like thought is totally unguided. If somebody asks, do we choose our own thoughts? Do we choose our thoughts? Not directly. Thoughts arise. We don't create them. We don't choose them really. They arise, but they can be guided, obviously, because through the intention of, say, thinking about an elephant, the mind will dive into this library of all of our conceptual knowledge and everything we learned about elephants, and you can start thinking about all this. It's like, well, it's a big gray thing. It's got big floppy ears, trunk. All this stuff starts just pouring out of, oh, you want to know about elephants, and the mind just starts regurgitating everything it's learned about elephants. And so there is a certain amount of indirect control in that we can intend on thinking about something, and then a bunch of related thoughts will suddenly start percolating. But as soon as the topic no longer holds that much interest or isn't particularly important anymore, unrelated thoughts start creeping in. Anybody who has tried to focus on a single thought will find this out very quickly, that as you start practicing the idea of focusing thought, that as you try to think about a single thought and focus and keep the focus on that one thought, you eventually become bored, and then other unrelated thoughts start popping in. Because that is the nature of the mind. It's like, well, it's not particularly important anymore, so I'm just going to wander off. And so it's not so important to really attend and focus at all times. I'm not even a real fan of practices of concentration like that, where you're just trying to get concentrated on a single thought. It's not particularly important. Yeah, it's a way to quiet the mind by just totally focusing on one thing, but as soon as you stop that practice, thoughts come in. It doesn't get rid of the root. It just gets rid of the greenery, so to speak. So, we accumulate this library of concepts, this library of thoughts. But then we're also taught that, if we did something bad, start thinking about and ruminating about what we did in the past. And then, as we're criticized, the inner critic forms to chastise us even when mama and papa aren't there. And this inner critic forms and this commentator. So as things happen, you'll just start labeling things as you see them or commenting on things. It's like, oh, how green this is, you'll just start commenting. And it's a habit we form. So not only is there's this library of knowledge for thought to just pull out of when we want to think about things, But there's all this reflexive thought that we habitually and conditionally have gained as well through life. And so this inner critic and labeler and critiquer forms. But this also just arises. We don't choose or even think of what thoughts arise. An event happens and the conditioned related thoughts just come forward. Someone does something rude or whatever, and the thought arises, how could he do that to me? Automatic. You didn't have to try to think it, it just came. Because it's a reflexive, refers to me thought. It starts creating this idea of me, which is also a thought. Most of our thoughts are all self-reflexive. They're all referring to a me of some kind. And through this repetitive thinking of there being a me, and through that's entwined in most all thought, we start to really feel there is a me, and this me must be the thinker. But you aren't the thoughts. You can't identify with the thoughts because the thoughts are just simply something being regurgitated out of the brain, mind, you could say. But basically it's all this library of labels and knowledge we've acquired and conditioned habitual thought. That's all it is. That's what thinking is, by and large. If you look at the vast majority of thought, that's what it is. It's all reflexive thought. It's critiquing. It's criticizing. It's labeling. It's pulling up past knowledge of what had happened. That is thought, by and large. But it's not something we do. It's just a function of the brain, the mind. It just arises. We didn't create it. The individual thought. We didn't create the individual thought, nor did we choose the individual thought. It's a reaction. It's just a response that arises due to stimulus. Something happens, thought arises. And the more that we think a certain way, the more the habit gets ingrained to think more that way, or even more deeply in that way. And so that's where you get into these downward and upward spirals, where you start thinking negatively, things get darker and darker and darker as you're going down this negative spiral, and the thoughts just get darker and darker and darker. That's just the way it works, because it's not a fixed constant. And so the mind is always moving, and it's at the direction of where is it moving. And so likewise, or opposingly, there can be an upward spiral, where if you're thinking more about, love, harmony, truth, unity, compassion, forgiveness, pick everything, things start brightening up. The thoughts become more positive. It is our own thoughts that kind of create and tint the world that we perceive. And it's not that we can create those thoughts, but we can look at and delve into the conditioning. We can look at the conditioning and bring unconscious conditioning to the conscious mind, and that often will change things. Also, you could realize that you've got a certain amount of control in attention, or the directions of thoughts, like thinking about an elephant. So you can actually consciously think in a more positive light to keep from going into a downward spiral. And so, there's things, there's like an indirect control of thought. Because if you're delving into the conditioning and trying to remove the conditioning that causes some of these reflexive thoughts from, reaction thoughts from arising, if you dig out the root and the same stimulus comes forward, the reaction no longer arises. And so that's indirectly impacting the thought. It's not directly creating or choosing the thought. All you're doing is rooting out the cause of the reaction, and then that reaction no longer comes forward anymore. Likewise, if you've noticed the direction of the thoughts is kind of in a downward spiral, you can halt or start going the other way by changing the intention of the thoughts. And if you can hold the attention long enough in a more positive direction, you'll find that things start brightening up again. So, thoughts are kind of a very ephemeral in that, we like to identify with them. That's the problem. We have all these reflective thoughts because they all refer to me. And so we start getting this idea that I'm the thinker and I create my thoughts. And then when we think something, when a thought arises that is perhaps not our best self per se, we think rather darkly or cruelly about somebody, or we see something happen and the thought arises of how it could be to our advantage or something like that. If we identify with our thoughts, then we beat ourselves up for having such thoughts. Which isn't the right thing to do, because you didn't create the thoughts, you didn't choose the thoughts. If somebody has some misfortune and the thought arises of how it's to your advantage, it is just a reaction. It's a reaction of the conditioning of the brain, the mind, to look for advantage. And so when it goes, oh, an advantage has appeared, it's only pointing out something that you probably always focus on. You're probably always looking for advantages. For someone who's finds that something horrible happens to somebody and you see how it's an advantage for you, if you start feeling horribly about this, you got to realize you probably focus on the advantages of life quite often. And so it's the brain just executing the routine. Oh, an advantage. Look how this could benefit me, is how it phrases it. And then we feel horribly about it. I can't believe I had such a thought, because we like to think ourselves to be good people, and so we shouldn't have these kind of thoughts. Because we think we control our thoughts and that the thoughts are me. But this isn't the case. We don't control our thoughts directly, and we're not our thoughts. It does not matter what the thoughts are. Instead, it's more about quieting this mind, cutting through the conditioning, the reactions. And there's many ways to do this, which I'm not going to get into today. But for people that kind of know about how to deal with conditioning, shadow work, however different ways of putting it, use whatever methods you want to play around with it. But there is conditioning for how thoughts arise and when and why. And it's not our fault that a thought arises. Because the thoughts aren't us. We're not under control of them. What matters more so is the action. You may have heard this many times, that regardless of the thought that's had, it's more about what we do with it, what we actually decide to do, that matters. And so even if a horrible thought arises, if we choose to ignore the thought and do something counter, then the thought had no real effect. And so we shouldn't beat ourselves up for any thoughts that arise. We didn't create them. We're not our thoughts. You're not the thinker. Don't identify with thoughts. Thoughts are simply arising. It's part of the conditioning. It's part of the vast library of conceptual thought that we've gathered in our lifetime. Between this library and the conditioning and habits we have, that's pretty much all of thought that comes up. And so you got to remember that changing thought really isn't the point. I mean, you can delve into the source, the root, the cause of such thoughts, and like I said, bring this unconscious conditioning to the conscious mind, delve into it, see it completely, and it may resolve itself. Or you may try to resolve it in other ways. But that will change how thoughts arise going forward. But in the end, I think it's better to instead build the habit of learning how to basically let go of thought. Because it's the habits of the mind that we have all this thought. And because it's a busy, busy world, and we're always hopping to the next thing, anytime things slow down, the mind starts throwing things that we have forgotten or hadn't had time to think about. And we grab onto them. We're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And we keep affirming to the brain that's trying to help. Good job. Keep throwing these things at me when things are slowing down and I've got time to look. And then we decide to learn meditation or be present. And as we're trying to just be still, all these thoughts come at us. And we're like, well, why can't I not thought? Why can't I cease thinking? Well, that's because you've been affirming for years. Anytime things slow down and there's a moment of silence, remind me about all this stuff. And so we need to build a new routine, so to speak, a new habit where, for this period of time, I don't care about any of this stuff. And you just simply ignore it. You never grab onto any thought, no matter how seductive or attractive the thought. And you basically build a new habit of giving basically instructions to the brain. You don't need to fill silence with thought. You can just let it stay silent. And it is possible to then just sit in silence and not think. And this is actually more valuable because in not thinking, you could, in just being still, there's just what is, and you're there. And so in the absence of all these thoughts, in the absence of all thought, and this deep, profound silence of mind, you still are. And as you're sitting in that, you can go, oh, I'm not any of this. I'm not any of these thoughts that arise because I still am, even when there's no thought. There's no chattering mind. There's no labeling. There's no conceptual thought. All this stuff has ceased, but I still am. And so many of us have forgotten this. So many of us identify with thought. And we've forgotten that we're not that. We never were that. So, but anyways, if you got any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.